Hello, welcome to lesson 15.1B. I've entitled this video, Post-War Alliances. This video is going to cover pages 896 to 898. What post-war alliances were formed? New military alliances emerged during the Cold War. A world peacekeeping organization was also established. NATO and the Warsaw Pact. To contain Soviet influences, the United States set up alliances with friendly nations. In 1949, the United States joined with many Western European countries to form a security alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. NATO countries agreed to defend each other against any attack. So here you can see the countries that are colored are the ones that were in NATO. Notice these are all Western European powers and the United States and Canada. So question number 31. What is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO? That is a group of countries that have Western Europe and the United States, and basically these countries are a security system. They agree that if one country is attacked, the other countries will come to their aid. This is an alliance system. In 1955, the Soviet Union formed its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Union dominated its Warsaw Pact neighbors, forcing them to follow its policies. So notice here are the countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact. Question 32. What was the Warsaw Pact? That was another military alliance formed after World War II or during the Cold War, but this was for the Soviet Union and its communist countries that it was controlling. And notice that they were forced to be in the Warsaw Pact. The United Nations. Many international disputes were brought before a new world organization called the United Nations, or UN. 51 nations ratified the UN Charter in October 1945. Over time, membership in the United Nations expanded as new nations were admitted. Question 33. What is the United Nations? That is an organization of the countries of the world in which they are trying to make sure that international disputes are solved as peacefully as possible. Keep in mind the United Nations is like the League of Nations Part 2, whereas in this organization, a lot of mistakes that were made from the League of Nations were learned. And so the idea is that don't repeat the same mistakes that made the League of Nations weak. Here is a picture of all the countries that are in the United Nations. Just to let you know, there are 195 countries in the world today, and 193 of those 195 are actually in the United Nations. So every country in the world but 2 are in the United Nations. And here is a map of the world, and as you can see, based on the color coding, you can see when these countries were either began with the United Nations or when they were eventually approved as new members, and in the time period they were allowed in. Under the UN Charter, member nations agree to bring disputes before the body for peaceful settlement. Every member has a seat in the General Assembly where problems can be discussed. A smaller Security Council, pictured on the right, also discusses conflicts that threaten peace. So now we can answer question 34. What is the purpose of the General Assembly in the United Nations? Their job is for every country that is a member, that is where they can bring problems of the world for the whole group of countries in the United Nations. Question 35. What is the purpose of the Security Council in the United Nations? Their job is to, and that's a smaller group of countries, then they basically discuss the conflicts around the world that threaten the peace of that world. Over the years, the United Nations has succeeded best in fighting hunger and disease and in improving education. UN relief programs have provided food, medicine, and supplies to victims of famine, war, and other disasters. Preserving peace has proved more difficult. Some nations have rejected UN resolutions, which are formal recommendations for courses of action. Still, UN negotiators and peacekeeping forces have sometimes eased dangerous crises. Question 36. What have been some of the greatest successes of the United Nations? They have been really good at fighting hunger, disease, and in improving education. They've also been very good at providing food, medicine, and supplies to victims that have suffered from famine, war, and other disasters. Question 37. What have been some areas where the United Nations has not been as successful? Well, preserving the peace. Sometimes words can't stop wars from breaking out. That's just a fact of, unfortunately, a fact of human life here on this planet. But definitely, the UN has had some successes in preventing some crises from getting even worse. And here we see a little pictograph here, and you can take a look at that, and you can see the different parts of the United Nations and some of the important dates of the United Nations. They are headquartered in New York City of our own country, and then there's also the place where the International Court of Justice is, and that's in The Hague in the Netherlands. And as you can see, the United Nations countries have grown from 51 and have expanded all the way to 193 of 195 more recently. Communist advancements. Until 1949, most Americans felt that their country had the upper hand in the Cold War. Then, in September 1949, the United States learned that the Soviet Union had tested an atomic bomb. Question 38. What did President Truman announce to the world in September of 1949 about the Soviet Union? That they had tested successfully an atomic bomb. No longer was the United States the only country in the world with a weapon of mass destruction. A second shock followed. Communist forces led by Mao Zedong gained power in China. The United States had long backed the nationalists led by Zhang Jixi, also known as Chiang Kai-shek. In 1949, after a long civil war, Mao's Red Army forced Zhang and his forces to retreat to Taiwan, an island off the coast of China. On the mainland, Mao set up the People's Republic of China. So question 39, what happened in China in 1949? There was basically a revolution or an overthrow after a long civil war, and the leader that America had backed was overthrown by the leader Mao Zedong, and he was a communist, and so he brought communism to China. Communist leaders in China and the Soviet Union often disagreed with each other, yet together the two nations controlled almost a quarter of the globe. Many Americans feared that communism would spread still farther. So question number 40, why were Americans concerned about the events in China in 1949? Well, Americans were worried and concerned that communism had started in the Soviet Union, had spread to Eastern Europe after the fall of those countries in World War II, and their expanse to Europe had gone all the way through much of Eastern Europe, and now it was starting to seep into and spread into China. And there was a concern of, oh my goodness, this is starting to spread like wildfire. Will we be able to stop it? Well, look at this picture in this slide. This is where the communist countries of the world exist today in 2018. So what you can see are a couple of things. Number one, there was a time with that lighter pink color where a lot of the world was actually controlled by communist countries, here and in here and here and here. And today, you can see that communism is not used in many countries, which shows you a couple of things. One, that communism failed for a variety of reasons. And two, that when people have a preference, they're going to prefer democracy. They're going to prefer capitalism. Because if communism was preferred, more countries would certainly have it. Well, thank you very much for watching. Before you go, I've got a United Nations joke for you. The United Nations conducts a survey worldwide. The only question asked was, would you please give us your honest opinion about solutions to the food shortage in the rest of the world? The survey was a complete failure. In Africa, they did not know what food meant. In China, they did not know what honest meant. In Europe, they did not know what shortage meant. In Russia, they did not know what opinion meant. In the Middle East, they did not know what solution meant. In South America, they did not know what please meant. And in the US, they did not know what, quote, the rest of the world meant. Thank you very much for watching, and have a nice day.